Hi friends, today we're reading George Washington's birthday, a mostly true tale. When George Washington went to sleep Friday night, he was 6 years old. When he woke up on Saturday, he was 7. It's my birthday, he thought. Happy birthday to me. George went down to breakfast. He peered out the kitchen door and checked the temperature. Another cold day, he said to his mother, but I guess there's nothing special about that. Certainly not, she said. Now your porridge and mine the baby. Fact, George cared a lot about the weather and later in life recorded temperatures in his diary every day. After breakfast, George went to the library for his morning lessons. Get to work, George, said his brother Augustine. I am working, said George, and don't blot your copybook. Tyrant, muttered George under his breath. George was usually very good at arithmetic, but not this morning. Augustine marked his paper. All wrong, he said with a sigh. You'll never amount to anything. Someday I'll be the boss of you, said George. But he made sure his brother couldn't hear that. George gave up on his lessons and went outside to visit the horses. He patted his father's old dray. She snorted at him. When I'm older, I'll ride a horse even bigger than you, said George. He imagined that he would name his own horse when he got older. Then George noticed how cold it was. I bet I'm turning blue, he thought. In fact, George was over 6 feet tall, and he rode a very, very tall horses, too. One of his favorite was named Blueskin. To warm himself up, George started tossing stones into the river. Some birthday toss this is, George said. All of George's friends strode by. Bet you can't throw one of these all the way across the river, said the young man. But I can, said George. He screwed his eyes up and made a birthday wish. Then he leaned back, wound back, and threw the stone all the way across the Hankin River. Lordy, that's pretty good for a 6-year-old, said the young man, and he ran off. George was so peeved about being called a 6-year-old that he tried to toss another stone across the river, sank before it got halfway. Myth. After George died, a legend grew up that he was so strong that he'd be able to throw a stone across the Red River, but that would have been very, very hard to do. By the time he got home, George was cold and grumpy and ready for some sweet tea by the fire. He waved to his father, working in the orchard. Glad to see you, son, said George's father. You can help me prune these cherry trees. But Papa, George began. Fetch the hatchet, said his father. George fetched the hatchet. He hacked off the old tree branches. It was hard work. His hand ached. His back was sore. This is no way to spend a birthday, thought George. I'm so mad I could just. George's father strode over to see his son. Who did this? He asked, though George thought the answer was pretty obvious. Don't you know what day it is? Said George. It's Saturday, said his father, and I'd advise you to think before you speak again. George figured he'd better confess. Father, he said, I cannot tell a lie. I was who chopped down the tree. George always used his best grammar when he was in trouble. His father sighed. I'm glad you told me the truth, son, he said. George started to smile. But I'm not happy about this tree. George, stop smiling. I suppose you better chop it down. Chop it all up now that the damage is done, his father said, and I'll put it in the woodshed to dry. The woodshed was across a little creek from the cherry orchard. Back and forth, George carried the heavy loads of wood, crossing the icy creek each time. Hope I never have to do this again, he said to himself. At last, he finished his work. Now clean your face and hands and powder your wig and occupy yourself gainfully until dinner time, said his father. Myth. Many people believe that George Washington wore a wig, but he did not. When he got older, he powdered his white hair to make himself look more distinguished. George went to his room. He got a piece of paper and started writing, but George wasn't sure this was what his father would call gainful occupation. So he thought that he would come up with some other ideas his father would like. In fact, almost 100 years ago, George turned 7. His birthday was commemorated by his friend General Lafayette at the grand and elegant dinner in Washington, D.C. He worked so hard on his list that he did not hear the bell ring for dinner. George, called his mother, get down here at once. George hurried down the stairs, but when he opened the door to the dining room, he got a mighty surprise. Happy birthday, George, said his family. Yay. sat down to dinner and had a grand feast in honor of the birthday boy. I thought you had all forgotten, said George. His mother gave him a squeeze. How could anyone forget your birthday, George Washington? She said. Oh, Mama, said George. You only say that because you're my mother. Fact, the Washingtons would not have thrown a party for George, but they might have had a large family dinner on his birthday. But to tell the truth, nobody did forget about George Washington's birthday ever again. Because we have President's Day off for George Washington's birthday. Have a nice day, friends.